Hello guys, in this video I'm going to be building this knocked out Sherman diorama featuring the Tamiya 1/35th scale Sherman Easy Eight and the Miniart US soldiers in Rainwear figures. As many of you will be aware, the Sherman Easy Eight, or the M4A3E8, was really the pinnacle of Sherman development. It was introduced in 1944 and it had a number of upgrades, including wider tracks, the famous HVSS suspension, which was supposed to give a much smoother ride and gave it the nickname the Easy Eight. Plus it had additional firepower, improved armour and wet stowage for the ammunition. This is the Sherman that also saw service in Korea, and in fact Tamiya do a Korean version of this kit. So if you've ever built any version of any Sherman from any company, then there won't be many surprises here. The build sequence is quite familiar, although of course being a more modern Tamiya kit, we do now get the bottom plates there for the sponsons so we can't see out onto the ground as we could in their earlier toolings. But suffice to say, despite the fact that we have no photo etch parts, the detail is good and the fit is perfect. So I'm going to leave you with the build sequence and then come back shortly to show you how I made the diorama. So there we go, that was quite a quick overview of the build, but I wanted to focus more on the painting, weathering and the diorama build, and it is really quite a straightforward kit to put together. So with the build finished but the key components separate for painting, it was time to choose the olive drab colour. Of course there are many versions of olive drab. I've got here Tamiya XF62, plus I've got AK Real Colours 23 and 24, which are olive drab and faded olive drab. And you can see just what difference there is there between those. I think the Tamiya is by far the greenest of the bunch, and probably not really what I was looking for in this build. So I went for the 23 AK Real Colours, which is the olive drab, and then a lighter, thinner shade of the faded olive drab over the top. You can see here just what a nice, flat, matte surface that has dried to. And hopefully you can make out some of that highlighting in the faded olive drab there as well. I use the same olive drab paints, but maybe mixing a little bit of the alternative colours or maybe a bit of yellow to paint the various stowage items. So a couple of spare wheels there, some jerry cans, some tarps, etc. For the tarps I would later go over those with a Vallejo model colour, but for now this kind of browny green olive drab tone is perfect. Now overall I did like the olive drab, and I did want a very dark, drab kind of colour tone for the overall diorama, but I did want to break up the Sherman a little bit. And I know that some Shermans in Europe did have the black disruptive bands applied to them, so using some blue tack I marked out a few areas where I could apply a slightly lightened black. Once we pull the masking away, I think that breaks up the outline of the Sherman quite nicely without being too overpowering. Next up are the decals. So I applied some VMS gloss varnish only to the areas where the decals were needed, because there are only small areas for them to be applied, basically on the side of the hull and on the side of the turret. Then it was time to pick out the individual details, like the tools in particular, and I always do this with Vallejo model colours. Typically I thin them with a small amount of water, and I find they flow perfectly. I'm using a sand colour here for the wood and a dark grey for the steel. Once I was happy with the decals, I applied a matte varnish from VMS, and then using the sepia oil paint from Abteilung 502, thinned with odourless thinners, I applied quite a heavy pin wash over the details. I'm remembering here that I want this tank to be knocked out, to be abandoned, to be heavily covered in mud and in a wet environment as well, so I need to be quite heavy with some of these effects, otherwise they're going to get lost later on. The matte varnish means that the wash sort of seeps into the surrounding paintwork a little bit, which on something like this, which as I say is going to be very filthy, that's not a problem. That really helps, if anything. That storage shelf on the front there is something I added from a piece of styrene. Now I don't feel like I did a great job on the tracks, to be honest, but thankfully a lot of it will be covered by mud. They're rubber band style tracks, which are fine. The initial paint layer I gave them was probably a bit too dark, a bit too black. Could have done with maybe a reddy brown mixed in with it. You can see here I have put a small amount of a rust wash in there. I didn't show that on video, but I cleaned a lot of that up because I wasn't quite liking the way it turned out. I decided against painting the rubber blocks and instead just went for the pencil wear effect, polishing effect on the outside of the tracks. I painted the additional details on that stowage which I showed you earlier. These have come from other kits or from 3D prints. As you can see, they're in about 50 shades of olive drab. I did want something though that would stand out from the various shades of olive drab, but something not too big, so I made this air identification panel. Shane Smith has a great tutorial on how to do this on his channel, and I just followed that. Once I was happy with the positioning of the stowage, I superglued the items together and then superglued them to the deck of the Sherman. The air recognition panel was secured in place using some rigging. Because the top hatches of the turret would be open, to suggest that the crew have abandoned it, I didn't want the viewer to be able to look in and see that the hull was empty, and also to get light from the shell hole which will be in the side. So I cut a rough circle of styrene, painted it black, and glued that to the bottom of the turret. It was time to do some basic weathering on the Sherman before I added it to the terrain base. I started with some AK wet ground acrylic paste. This has been thinned a little with water. The purpose of this is to provide a texture on the vehicle. I'm not too fussed about the colour at this stage. But because we're operating in a very muddy environment, I really slapped this on all over the underside of the vehicle. This might look a bit over the top, but if you look at reference photos, you can see that there are some very heavily muddied and weathered vehicles out there. Next up was some oil paint streaking. I took a selection of brown oil paints, applied them initially as a dot filter, so lots of dots of paint all over the surface, especially on the vertical surfaces. Then streaked downwards using some thinner. I went a bit heavier with this than I normally would, simply because it is supposed to be a very dirty, very muddy environment. Similarly, on the horizontal surfaces here, like the top of the turret, I put a lot more paint on than I normally would. Although, to be honest, by the time you see the final model, you realise that these effects do blend in quite well. A couple of these oil paints had a bit of a gritty texture to them. I'm not quite sure why, but that did mean they worked quite well on the engine deck, where I imagine crews would be walking, to give an appearance of sort of mud coagulating and collecting there. Now, I haven't shown much of the figures in this video simply because I'm not really confident in my figure painting skills, and I don't think they're particularly useful to show you in extreme detail. But I use these Miniart US soldiers in Rainwear, which is a great set. I find Miniart plastic quite soft, and although the fit is decent, I did need to fill those seam lines. The figures were given a base coat of black, and then a variety of greens were used, just like the Sherman, just like the stowage, to paint their uniforms. And then I ended up with something like this, which wasn't terrible, but wasn't brilliant. I've tried to enhance the weapons a bit by using some oil paints over the brown to give a wood grain. And I've used a very simple darker green to do the shadows on the uniform, and a lighter green to do some simple highlights. The straps there are made from thin Tamiya tape. I will do a more in-depth figure video at some point in the future, but I'm afraid it's not today. The next step was to build the base, and I wanted this Sherman, having been hit, lose control and basically go off the side of the road into a ditch. I saw a few reference photos which gave me some inspiration. Then I took the insert from a picture frame. The sides of that weren't high enough, so I attached my own sides, but it was a good start because the existing frame was nice and square, and of course it was a good anchor for those extended sides. I then built up the road and the slope using some offcuts of XPS foam. The terrain's not going to be made from those, they just use up space so that I will require less sculptor mould. And a thinner layer of sculptor mould means that everything will dry more quickly and the overall weight will be reduced. Here I'm positioning the currently legless figures. This is to get an idea of the general composition and to just make sure that everything is roughly in the right place. The sculptor mould was mixed quite thickly. While the sculptor mould was still drying, I wrapped the Sherman in cling film, kitchen wrap, and pushed it into the ground to make a space for it to fit properly. I have no idea why I did this without the tracks attached. I don't know what happened there, clearly I should have done. I used my finger to work some grooves and some ruts into the road to represent vehicle tracks. And took the Sherman tracks and pressed them in for the same reason. The wet sculptor mould will easily wash off those tracks as long as you do it quickly. Once everything was dry, which takes typically about 24 hours for sculptor mould, everything was given a coat of brown. Often I would use XF52 flat earth for this, but because I wanted a wetter, darker terrain, I used XF9 brown, I think. I did also spray a couple of other colours to give some highlights, but of course this is going to change massively and most of it will be covered up by the wet effects. At this point I could cut away the excess at the sides, and this was probably the best time to do it because it would mean that I could then bring the terrain over those sides there later on. I decided that we needed a bit of visual interest in the corner, so I found this spare telegraph pole from an old Miniart kit, ummed about which corner, then decided on this one. So I used 3 products for the terrain and the weathering. The first of these was the AK Terrain's Wet Ground, which is an acrylic paste. The main reason I used this is because it had a little bit of texture to it. And this was the paste which I used to blend in the edges over that wooden frame, and in a few places on the terrain to break up the uniformity of the surface. However, one thing you will notice is that the colour of this paste is not particularly nice. It's a little bit too yellow-brown for my preference. However, that's not a major problem because we will go over all of this groundwork shortly. To do that, I'm going to be using these other 2 effects. These are both from Ammo by MIG. We've got Wet Mud, which is one of their heavy mud ranges, and then we've got Wet Ground, which is one of their splashes range. Both of these were thinned with various levels of odourless thinner. I had the option of using 2 more splashes effects as well, but I didn't really like the colour of these, they're a bit too light, so I did use a small amount of the loose ground, but I used none of the Turns Dirt. Now at this point I was looking at my base and it wasn't really matching the vision that I had for it. So I spent quite a long time trying to work out what it was I didn't like. I could tell that I didn't like it, but I couldn't really tell why. And as I say, I was ignoring the colour because I knew that would change, but I realised that a lot of it was the texture. To a certain extent, the scale of this terrain is slightly out. There's not a lot of fine texture and things like that on it. So in order to fix that, I took some static grass, I mixed it into some wet ground terrain paste from AK, and I spread it over a large part of the diorama, particularly down the slope and at the bottom of the slope. Not so much on the road because I wanted the road to have been worn down. I think that started to improve things slightly. It was also at this stage that I committed the tank to the ground permanently. So I pushed it into the still wet paste. That will provide a very strong bond, and it also gave me the opportunity to work the paste up to and over the tracks to really make it look like the tank was stuck in there. As you can tell from the image of it dried, that AK wet terrain doesn't really have a particularly nice colour. I really don't like it at all. It's a bit too, what, yellow? Just doesn't quite look right. But that's fine because everything's going to be covered. This is where I use the Ammo by MIG wet mud and wet ground. I also made a third shade of mud by mixing those two enamels 50-50. Then it was just a case of using those enamel effects to blend the colours in the road, to blend the Sherman to the ground, and try to give a realistic looking wet effect. I couldn't tell you from the video which effect is which, and to be honest it doesn't really matter that much. They're both thinned with odourless thinner. Of course I am allowing them to mix here on the ground as well. I'm wet blending them, because what we don't want is big areas which are all the same, where it's just single blocks of colour. Sometimes I'd wait for certain areas to get a bit drier and then add another colour, so they wouldn't fully blend, but that it would sort of have a limited blend. I did also go back and change my mind on the loose ground and thought at the very tops of some of those pieces of dirt I'll just add a lighter, slightly drier colour. As you can see, I'm basically covering all of the original dirt colour, both from the terrain paste and from the paint I airbrushed on, and I'm starting to get happier with this. However, what was very interesting to me is the way that it looked once it was dry, which is quite different. So the colours are the same of course, but it has got a very matte finish, which surprised me given that both those enamels were called wet ground or wet earth. However, this is nothing that a varnish or some wet effects couldn't change. And of course, if you think about it, if you do go outside in a muddy field when it's raining, the mud is darker, but it isn't glossy, it isn't reflective. So I think that probably is a more realistic appearance for it. I wanted to better blend the Sherman with the terrain, so I took some of the enamel paints that I used before, thinned them right down with odourless thinner, and did lots and lots of splatter effects, particularly up the side, particularly up the rear, making sure some of it went up onto the stowage, making sure I got the bottom side as well. I figured mud might get kicked up or walked up onto the tank and then run down again, so I put some of those enamels directly onto the side skirts. And I thought that looked a bit better. It had a bit more texture than previously, but I still wasn't super happy with it. Actually, to be honest, this shot here doesn't do the colour a lot of justice either. The Sherman looks a lot greener here than it should do. But I still thought it needed a bit more low-level detail. So I got some of these Jarvis leaves, and I figured the easiest way to get these to stick to the terrain would be to take some more of that enamel effect, that mud effect, dampen down the surface, and then push the leaves in. And then sprinkle the leaves on and roll them around in it. Because of course even the leaves are going to be muddy, they're not going to be sitting on top nice and clean. And I think slowly that is getting to sort of how I've envisioned it. Of course we've still got the water effects to go, but that is definitely getting closer. The next step was to go back to that sepia oil paint, thin it far less this time, and use it to try to increase the depth and the shadows on both the Sherman and the terrain. So these might be areas that are deeply in shadow, or there might be damp areas of mud. Really I'm trying to highlight edges here and details and bring out the contrast. Then it was time to add the figures into position. Perhaps I should have done this after I added the water effects, but I wanted to be sure that I wasn't going to have any of the soldiers standing in water. These guys were super glued to the base, then some more of the enamel mud effects were used to blend their feet in with the ground. Then it was time to take the Woodland Scenics Realistic Water, give it a bit of a stir but not a shake. This dries clear, but I wanted my mud to be brown, so I added a couple of drops of Vallejo model colour, literally just 3 or 4 drops. Made sure it was thoroughly blended. Then poured it into the appropriate places. You can only pour thin layers of this at a time. For the puddles on the road that wasn't a problem, but for the big puddle under the Sherman I would need another layer. With that done and everything given time to dry, my model was complete. So there we go guys, that was my destroyed, abandoned Sherman diorama. I hope you liked it. I've been working on this for a long time. Looking back at the first video files, I recorded them in September 2022, so what's that? That's a good 6 months ago. You might have noticed at the start of the video I was wearing my blue down jacket because I was modelling in the garage in winter in my old house, and by the time I finish the video I'm indoors in my new house in the nice warm room. But I think it was worth it in the end. I'm quite happy with the way it turned out. Of course there are always extra things that we could add, so for example I don't have any footprints here in the mud, which is maybe a bit of a oversight on my part. And I'm still not 100% sure about the shininess level, the gloss level of the Sherman itself. Perhaps I should have given that a matte or maybe a semi-gloss coat and then just use the water effect to have some streaks coming down it. But either way, as I say, I'm fairly happy with the way it turned out. I also feel that I'm sort of coming to the end of this project now and I'm ready to move on to something new, so I feel like it was a good time to stop. One thing I hope you guys don't do is stop watching. If you did like this video, please remember to give it a thumbs up and add a comment below. And if you haven't already, then please do consider subscribing. My Patreon supporters and YouTube members deserve a huge thanks from me for all of their continued support. They contribute in so many ways to the channel and it is massively appreciated. Thank you very much guys. And those members have also seen a few sneak previews of my upcoming videos. I've been trying to go with a build at the weekends and a shorter mini review or mini build in the middle of the week. Hopefully you've been enjoying that, and of course if you do have any suggestions then do feel free to leave a comment below.